Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I wish to associate myself entirely with all of the comments that my two colleagues have just made from either side of this House. I wonder, Mr. Deputy Speaker, what it says about our ability to function as a body which makes and reviews legislation, that such a significant piece of legislation dealing with such a major social problem can lie on the statute book for 50 years without review or amendment. All the more incredible when we consider that by any conceivable measure it has been an abject failure in trying to achieve what it set out to achieve. As we have just heard, back in 1971, 1% of the British population said that they used the drugs which the MDA would go on to criminalise. Today, that figure is 34%. We are facing the biggest social policy catastrophe of our generation. We have thousands of people dying every year needlessly because they do not know what they are taking and help is not available for them when things go wrong. We have tens of thousands of people every year who get a criminal record at the way in which we try and tackle this problem. And there are hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, living in communities up and down this land whose lives are blighted, not just by the misery of people dependent on those drugs in those communities, but by the brutal violence which is used by organised crime to enforce their regulation and supply of these products. By any measure, this policy ought to be reviewed, this legislation ought to be reviewed. But of course it's worse than that, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's not just the fact that the legislation hasn't been able to do what it wanted to do. It's worse than that because the legislation is now an active cause of the problem, because the entire area is looked at not as one of public health or well-being, but as one of criminal activity. And the centre of the Misuse of Drugs Act is to criminalise people who use drugs. And that does a number of things. First of all, that immediately means the state has no role in the supply and regulation of these products, and that responsibility is given to the private sector and to organised crime within the private sector. That is the first consequence of the Misuse of Drugs Act. The second is that if people are getting into trouble and need medical help because of their substance addiction, many of our health and social care staff working in our public agencies are unable or unwilling to put themselves at risk of criminal prosecution by offering that help. And of course, I'd happily give way, yes?
If that's true, how does he account for the fact that we have tens of thousands of heroin users on methadone replacement therapy?
I will come on to look at the concept of drug consumption rooms in a minute, but what I'm talking about is the fact that people have no ability to come to a health professional and say, what is this? They've no ability to ask for clean needles because these actions are prohibited under the 1971 Act and the schedules to it. But the third thing, which has already been remarked upon, is that what the Misuse of Drugs Act does is it stigmatises big time those who use drugs and puts them in a position where they are unlikely, because of social opprobrium, to come and ask for help. Now, we surely need to have a review and a fresh think about a problem which is so manifestly out of control and where the existing legislation is so manifestly unable to provide any assistance. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I always like to try and see the other side of the argument. So I want to try and put myself, I want to ask the question, why is it that people are resistant to review? Why is it that they want to hold on to things as they are? And I can only conclude that it's because they fear the consequences of decriminalisation or of changing the law. They must somehow think that if we were to do that, that we would unleash floodgates of supply into communities where there aren't already drugs, that there would be many more millions of people who would get caught up in this problem because we would not have the criminal mechanisms that we have at the minute. And I say to any colleagues who think that, wake up. Wake up and see what is happening on the streets of your own constituency. Come with me to any medium-sized town in this country. Come and stand in a bar and make your intentions known, what you would like, and within 1 hour, you will be offered any drug of your choice. If you don't want to have the personal contact, order in advance. Go on the internet and you will find a mobile phone number where you can, through the County Lines network, order whatever you want and it will be delivered to your door. Sometimes you will even get a customer service message asking for feedback on the supply. That is the extent of what we have at the moment. And it is just fantasy to suggest that there are loads of people out there who might otherwise get into drugs who are somehow prevented from doing so by the Misuse of Drugs Act. It is not the case. So we need to surely have a grown-up conversation about what we do of the situation where a third of our citizens potentially could be made criminals by the existing legislation and where it is so manifestly unfit for purpose. I'd like to hope that the Home Office and current ministers could begin that process of review with an open mind, rather than just defending the status quo, and be prepared to look at an evidence-based approach, drawing in international comparisons, and try and work up a better system which is grounded in protecting public health and well-being, rather than trying to criminalise behaviour. I would support, my party will support, I think support will be there from all across the House for any bold minister who wanted to take that initiative and begin that dialogue. I'm not saying prescriptively what should be in it. I'm not saying how it should be done. I simply want to have the dialogue, the discussion and the debate because too many people are dying for us not to do so. But while we are doing that, there are some immediate things that we ought to do. And I want to just turn for a moment to the question of drug consumption rooms, probably better called overdose prevention centres. These are medical facilities, and I have been in them and seen them working in Portugal, in Germany, and in Canada. These are facilities where someone who is using drugs can go and can use their own drugs under medical supervision in a medical facility. This isn't going to make the overall problem any better, but what this will do is drive a focus into the very sharp end of the problem, the point at which people are dying. Because what happens at the moment is not that people voluntarily overdose because they're fed up with life and they want to just commit suicide. That's not the case at all. What is happening is that people are taking substances and they don't even know what's in them. Sometimes a lethal concoction, sometimes much, much stronger than they thought it was going to be. And because it's all criminal activity, they do this activity behind closed doors. It's not something you do in the open. You have to do it behind closed doors. And by the time you realize you have a problem, by the time you can't breathe or you have your heart attack or you need medical help, it is too late to call for assistance. So for the limited number of people in those circumstances, being able to fulfill their immediate addiction under medical supervision would literally be a lifesaver. That is what happens in other countries. It is, it's blindingly obvious that we ought to try and consider that happening here, but the law forbids it. And even pending a change in the law, I do believe that by regulation, the Home Office should allow pilot centres of this to emerge so that we can see for ourselves whether it would work here. After all, what is there to lose? Nothing to lose. Everything to gain. Lives to gain. Now, this doesn't stop people using drugs. This doesn't get rid of the problem. This doesn't make people, get their life back together. It doesn't get people the medical help they might need, the social services help they might need. It doesn't get them a job if they haven't got one. Of course it doesn't. But it keeps them alive long enough so that those interventions can then take place further down the line. And you cannot give help to a dead person. So that is why it is so vital that we have a sensible discussion about these drug consumption rooms and supervised facilities. And the Scottish Government stands ready and has been pressing the Home Office to allow them to go ahead and do this in Glasgow. Which brings me to the final point. I know you wanted people not to go on too long, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So the final point I want to talk about is this, and that is the interrelationship between the devolution of political authority and administrative action in the United Kingdom and this particular problem. Because we have a bit of a disjuncture in that the whole criminal framework, the 1971 Act and others, is a reserved matter here for Westminster, which sets the problem, if you like. But dealing with the consequences of that, the health and social care and the economic fallout from that policy is a matter for the devolved administrations. And it would seem to me a matter of ultimate sense, not getting into the arguments about Scottish independence or whatever. It would just be a matter of grown-up policy to have the same part of government responsible for the regulation as is responsible for mopping up the consequences of the problem. And that's why I think when the time comes, we need to urgently look at devolution of the controls currently in place in the 71 Act and whatever replaces it, to go to the devolved administrations and to be located within a health and social care context which is already devolved. Now, in advance of that, and I asked the Minister, I've spoken with the Minister several times on this matter, and I trust that he is thoughtful on the matter. I do think he is prepared to consider other points of view. I think he's prepared to consider evidence, but I think he feels himself mightily constrained by tradition, convention, and perhaps by political pressure elsewhere. I say to him, though, he has received a letter now from the Drugs Minister in Scotland, Angela Constance, asking for a four-nation summit to consider, amongst other things, working on a pilot basis to establish these types of medical facilities. And I hope very much that in his remarks today he will confirm that he's taking a positive reaction to that response and that he is prepared, if we can't change things overnight across the whole of the United Kingdom, let us employ the apparatus of devolution to allow one part of the United Kingdom to go beyond where other parts perhaps are willing to go at the minute, and to collate the evidence, to point a way to the future which could then lead to best practice being adopted throughout the entire place. We have a responsibility not to continue to stick our heads on the sands in this matter. It's been a collective exercise of ignoring the blinding obvious for far too long. And I appeal to colleagues, we're not having a vote today, but I appeal to colleagues to do what they can through the various structures of this place and within their political parties, because this should not be a matter that divides us on party grounds. To consider the question about why we need a review after this half-century, why things are so clearly wrong that we must do something. And we cannot continue to stick our head in our sands and pretend that things are okay. Now, the moment 50 years after the passage of this Act, is the time to admit that it isn't working and to do better. And the citizens of this country deserve it.